Hello and welcome to the second video on preparing for the AP Literature exam. As a reminder, all the resources that I will be referring to are in your OneNote. So if you go to your OneNote, you will see that there are several pages focused on poetry. So you have the poetry analysis review page with three sample prompts, and thesis statements to correspond to those. Then for this first prompt, you have a student sample response. So if you click on that PDF, it will open those student responses so you can see what the scores looked like for those varying levels of responses. Then I've also provided you with some practice resources. You have two documents here. First one is about useful poetic terms. So if poetry is not something you're very familiar with, like rhythm, rhyme, um, maybe there are poetic devices like automatopoeia, things like that that you're not as familiar with, look through this document. Then there's also a document about tips on reading poetry and something to think about as you're reading a poem as opposed to another piece of prose fiction. Then there are actually, you have these sample prompts. I've given you extras down here. The two here have student samples with their scores to go along with them. So I recommend you look at the prompt first, do your own planning or practice writing, and then look at the student samples. So the student samples don't influence your response. So for those two, and these are from the 2023 exam, so very current. And then these prompts are from some older exams, but you can kind of get a feel for the kind of questions they will ask you about the poem. So going back to poetry. So what should you expect when you're looking at the free response poetry essay? It is going to be the first one that you are presented with. So we call it Q1. And you don't have to write the essays in any particular order. So if you feel more confident in one and you want to just knock that one out, you can do that. You will be labeling your responses in your Blue Book app because you'll be typing all of these essays. So you'll be labeling those responses accordingly to which question you're answering. So, like I said, for the essay section, you have three questions. You have poetry, prose fiction, which also includes drama, and then an open prompt. You'll have 2 hours. This is worth 55% of your score, and each essay is scored on a scale from 0 to 6. And you get those points in three different ways, so I will explain that a little bit later. But just again, keep in mind you have 2 hours, you have to pace yourself. So no one's going to say, okay, move on to the second essay or move on to the third essay. This will be up to you. So when you look at your poetry prompt, you will have a poem and then they will have a very specific prompt related to that poem. So you're going to read a passage of poetry, you're going to respond to the prompt with a thesis that presents a poetic interpretation backed up by evidence. So the same kind of writing you've been doing in all of your English classes where you look at the text, you make an argument about the text, and then you back it up with your evidence. So here's a sample prompt. It says, carefully read Olive Signor's 2005 poem Plants. Then, in a well organized essay, analyze how the poet portrays the complex relationship among the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life. You may wish to consider the author's use of such literary techniques as syntax, diction, and figurative language. So, a couple things about this prompt. It's always going to say in a well organized essay. So you can kind of skim over that part. It's going to expect you to organize yourself into some kind of introduction, um, some kind of body paragraphs, and then a concluding paragraph. And those introductory and concluding paragraphs do not need to be long. But this is where the key comes in. You want to analyze how the poet portrays, and what are they wanting you to analyze? The complex relationships among the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life. So this is what your thesis statement should be addressing. It tells you to consider the author's use of these literary techniques. One thing you do not want to do is just use these devices in a very general way in your thesis, like the author uses syntax to portray the complex relationship among the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life. That's just restating what they've asked you to do without making a specific argument. So you want to make sure that you're not only answering and addressing the question that they're asking, but that you're doing it in a very specific way. So if you're going to focus on syntax, what kind of syntax are we talking about? Is there repetition? Is it the use of couplets? What is it about the structure of this poem that portrays this complex relationship among speaker, implied audience, and plant life? You have to tell us, what is that complex relationship? And the more specific you are, the stronger your thesis statement will be. So here is an example for what a good thesis statement might look like. The structural model is one that you should be familiar with. So we could say through, and then whatever techniques you're going to examine. So you have to figure that out. Are you going to look at repetition? Are you going to look at a particular kind of word choice? Is it um, a certain kind of imagery? The speaker illustrates, and then what you pinpoint as the complex relationship among speaker, implied audience, and plant life. So here is an example. Note that this student is going to use two sentences for the thesis rather than one. Nowhere does it say you have to use one sentence for your thesis, unlike what we require in our classes here at CA. The AP readers, they understand that you are writing from a prompt and a poem that you have never seen before, and you have very limited time to respond. So they do not expect perfection, but they do expect you to make a clear argument. So here we have the speaker warns the audience not to underestimate the clever machinations of plants, characterizing them as manipulative beings whose goal is to take over the world. The speaker argues his points through sinister diction, personification of plant life, and direct addresses to the audience. So notice they're talking about diction and figurative language and a syntactical device, which is the direct address to the audience, but they don't say diction, imagery, and syntax. They are specific. They talk about sinister diction, personification of the plant life, and direct addresses. So that's what you need to do when you are identifying the literary techniques that you're going to focus on. And then we have their argument is here. It's warning the audience not to underestimate plants. They're manipulative. They're trying to take over the world. So that all the evidence is going to point to this particular argument. And like I said, in the OneNote, you have sample student responses, so you can read through how other people responded as well. Here's another sample prompt. And you can see this poem in your OneNote. It says the following poem is by Rachel M. Harper. Read the poem carefully. Then, considering such elements as imagery, form, and tone, write a well-organized essay in which you analyze the relationship between music and the speaker's complex memories of her family. So again, it says imagery, form, and tone, but you're not going to use those words in your thesis statement. You're going to tell me what imagery are we focused on? Is it a certain symbol? Is it personification of something? Form, that's just another word for syntax or structure. And then tone, you always have to identify a specific tone, a positive or negative description of the tone. What is the tone that's being conveyed? And then again, well-organized essay. And what are you supposed to analyze? The relationship between music and the speaker's complex memories of her family. So what is that relationship between music and the speaker's complex memories? That the answer to that question is the claim that you're making. So again, through the defined techniques you'll examine, the speaker suggests what you pinpoint as that relationship between music and the speaker's complex memories of her family. So here's what that might look like. Through her use of comparative metaphorical language and auditory imagery, Harper conveys the timeless and uniquely personal nature of music and its ability to evoke the emotionality of her childhood to her father. So they've addressed the question specifically. They've given specific techniques with this comparative metaphorical language auditory imagery. So you know exactly where all the evidence is going to come from and how it relates to this particular claim. Here's one more. Read carefully the following poem by Richard Wilbur, first published in 1949. Then write an essay in which you analyze how the speaker describes the juggler and what that description reveals about the speaker. You may wish to consider poetic elements such as imagery, figurative language, and tone. So again, we're going to be specific. If we're going to talk about imagery, what kind of figurative language, what kind of tone, and then you're focused on how the speaker describes the juggler and what that description reveals about the speaker. They did put 1949 here, so that's something to think about. Um, any kind of juggler in a modern sense, you might have to like go back in time in your brain and think about, okay, in 1949, after World War II, what might people be thinking of jugglers? That kind of thing. So we have through the defined techniques, the speaker underscores what you pinpoint is revealed about the speaker given the speaker's description of the juggler. So here's an example. Through utilization of frequent alliteration and somewhat off-kilter rhyme, as well as diction evoking an almost spiritual level of power in reference to the juggler, the speaker creates an image of a juggler managing to overcome gravity, to lift spirits as well as objects, and reveals their own inability to overcome dull, monotonous days forever lacking brilliance. So they've addressed the question, they've given specific literary techniques in their thesis statement. So to prepare for this kind of prompt, review those resources, useful poetic terms and tips on reading poetry, and then write either one full essay response or detailed outline responses to two of the poetry prompts in the OneNote. So you can either write a full response, so you can take your 40 minutes and time yourself, take 10 to 15 minutes to plan, and then the rest of the time to actually write it. For an outline response, you can take about 20 minutes to read and annotate the poem, then think about what your thesis would be, think about topic sentences for your 2 or 3 body paragraphs, and then indicate the evidence that you would use for each body paragraph. So it's a little different than a full response, just depends. I recommend maybe one detailed outline and then the other one do a full response and see how you do. Our next review session will be, again, a drop-in in U114. That'll be in April during a community day. Again, complete at least one multiple choice practice before you come to that, and then write or outline practice essays for the poetry prompt and then the other two as well, which I will go over in the next video.